This is the third week of our 10-week Ask Me Anything sermon series. And so each week, I am preaching in response to a question submitted by a person in the church. And this week's question is, what do we know about Jesus' early life? We hear a lot about Jesus as a baby around Christmas time. You know, the shepherds and the angels and Mary and Joseph. And then in Epiphany, we hear about his blessing in the temple when Simeon and Anna recognize him as the Messiah and cry out in celebration. And then we get one story about him sort of mouthing off to his mom as a preteen when Mary can't find him, and he says, "Woman, didn't you know that I would be in my Father's house?" And that story may be in the Bible just to make parents of mouthy teenagers feel better. I'm not sure. But besides those little vignettes, we hear very little about Jesus between his babyhood and when he begins his ministry by being baptized in the River Jordan. And so what happened in those intervening years? The Bible doesn't tell us. And we don't have any other primary sources from that period that speak specifically to Jesus. There's no reason that we would, because historians don't typically write about poor, random Jewish children living relatively ordinary lives, which is what we have to suspect Jesus was doing, more or less. But the Bible does give us a good foundation for thinking about Jesus' family. And then we have extra biblical sources, including the ancient historian Josephus, Roman records, and archaeology, that tell us a fair amount about life in Galilee, where Jesus spent his youth. Galilee was a beautiful but poor region, which was more religiously diverse than much of the Judean territories. This suggests that young Jesus would have had a higher than average exposure to non-Jewish people and their ways of living and thinking. Galilee was also remarkable in that it resisted the Roman occupation fiercely. There were cyclical uprisings and unrest, all of which were brutally crushed by Rome. Crucifixion was a common punishment for political dissidents in the Galilee. And Jesus would have been exposed to political dissent and a cultural yearning for freedom from a very early age. We know that he would have grown up under a regime that regularly enslaved and murdered people who contradicted them. And we know that by the age of 6, Jesus would have seen someone die on a cross. It is also clear that Jesus was from a remarkably devout family. He was literate in the scriptures. In his later life, he's able to quote the scriptures at the drop of a hat. And so we know that he must have spent much of his youth studying the Torah. So what do we know about Jesus' early life? We know that he was a poor and insignificant Jewish boy who grew up in a religiously diverse community where people yearned for freedom from oppression. And we know that all of these factors, along with his call from heaven, spurred him towards a revolutionary and world-changing ministry that began with his baptism, which is a great coincidence because, of course, this is a baptism Sunday today. And grounding ourselves in those geopolitical realities of Jesus' early life helps us see the waters of baptism better. You see, to begin his ministry and accept his divine call, Jesus walked into the River Jordan. And the River Jordan ran through, occupied, and divided Judea. It is the only landmark that connects each of the provinces that were separated by Rome. In the context of his time, Jesus begins his ministry essentially by going into a demilitarized zone and submersing himself in the one thing that connected all of the peoples living under occupation. And so today, as we prepare to welcome baby William into the family and community of this church, it is good to start by grounding ourselves in the realities of Jesus' time and place. For the world that he was born into was a world of division and poverty, brutality, and hardship. A place where crosses dotted the landscape and people were separated from each other based on borders drawn on the whims of an occupying power. But when it became time for him to take up his mantle, Jesus, as his first public act, walked into water. Water that touched every part of this hurting and divided land. Water that defied the divisions enforced upon the population. Water that brought life and hope to a scared and hurting people. The waters of the River Jordan. The waters of baptism. From the very beginning, the waters of baptism have intentionally transcended divisions and have signified healing and hope over and against the powers that be and the common sense of the world. And they still do that today. You see, by the standards of the world, baby William is not our baby. We are not his family, and we do not have any special claim on him, and he doesn't have any special claim on us. But today, we promise to share responsibility for him, to support his family as he grows up in community. Radical responsibility and shared community making is what we do as the church. We care for one another, even though by the standards of the world, we do not have to. And we care for our neighbors, even outside of this building, whether that is feeding folks through the food bank, housing people through Family Promise, or building community and faith sharing through small groups. And we take responsibility for one another in this way, and we form community this way because that is the ministry that Christ began in the River Jordan. Walking into the waters of baptism, he rejected the systems of brutality and division, and he replaced them with a vision of unity and justice and forgiveness that flows down the ages and inspires us and challenges us and beckons us to come and do likewise. And so now, we will share that promise and that hope and that call with the Kent family. I invite baby William and his family to come and join me here on the chancel.